Well, good morning, afternoon, or evening. I'm Professor Rios, and welcome to the lesson on Chapter 12 for Human Geography. This is an updated lesson as of the fall of 2024 to bring in some new data and new information that's been made available. So, having said all that, let's get going with the lesson. Again, there you see Political Geography, Chapter 12. Let me get to the beginning. And let's get going. So again, political geography naturally is something that people associate with, well, politics, right? And while that is an aspect of political geography, it is much more than just elections, for example. But having said that, let's look at some election data in the United States, going back to the election of 2016 won by Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton. This is the famous, if you want to call it that, blue and red county map for every single state. Now, these maps are good, they're useful. They can be a little bit misleading because you have big counties that are like all blue or all red, and they may not have a lot of people, whereas you have small counties like the ones in New York that are small but have lots of people. And so, but this at least gives you a pattern, something to look at. And you begin to see some of the same patterns from election to election, but from election to election, you also see differences. So this is what happened in 2016 following two administrations of Barack Obama, a Democrat. Okay. Before that, you had two administrations of George W. Bush, a Republican. So you sort of see this sort of back and forth that happens a lot in American elections. Personally, I think that's a good thing. It's almost like an arresting mechanism to keep one party from becoming entirely too powerful. And it's something that just naturally tends to happen in American elections from cycle to cycle. So this is 2016. Fast forward to 2020 when Joe Biden beat Donald Trump. And this map looks a lot more blue than the previous one. And I know there are different shades of blue, and here there's a differentiation between red. So if it was really, really, really red, you see a much darker color, whereas some places looks exceptionally blue. And so that's a higher percentage of Democratic votes versus Republican votes. But you still see some of the same patterns. You can see the patterns near the um, Mexico-US border in this election, or go back to the election of 2016. And then now fast forward to the election of 2024, where Donald Trump beat Kamala Harris, and then here's what you see. So it's a little bit, again, different kind of map, meaning different style, the same counties and the same coloring that takes place. But for example, you see that there's a lot less blue in the US-Mexico border. The state of Texas, 252 total counties. 242 of them went to Donald Trump. So there was a definite shift, obviously, more to the right um, in this election. And there's a whole host of reasons as to why that could be. The border, certainly, the issues with the border, illegal migration into the United States definitely played a role. And you see that manifested in what the counties look like near the Texas-Mexico border if you compare 2024 to 2020 to 2016. All right. Again, there's more to these maps than just looking at these county coloring. For example, big cities, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, they tend to go heavily Democratic. Chicago, New York, Boston, Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, Austin. But even within some of these counties, the numbers changed significantly from the left to the right in the election of 2024. What that will look like for the election of 2028, well, stay tuned. Obviously, lots of changes continually happen. All right. So this is just to give you a sense of how it's evolved over the past three presidential elections, which have been frankly rather consequential, every single one of them. But as I mentioned, in the United States, we tend to have these swings that go from right to left, and they happen often. And they also happen in the House of Representatives, and it also happens in the Senate. It's just one of those sort of like checking mechanisms that keeps any one political power or political party, rather, from obtaining entirely too much power. And in a country where we only have two political parties, that becomes, frankly, even more important, quite frankly, simply because you don't want one political party to have all the power because it would basically disenfranchise a significant segment of the overall population, right? So that's the elections, at least the election side in the United States. Now, political geography, again, the study of the organization and distribution of political phenomena. And of course, elections happens to be one component of that, but you can look at the characteristics of states, boundaries, and boundary disputes. Okay, the idea that state and nation are not synonymous, at least in the context of political geography. They have very distinctive meanings that we apply to them. Okay, so let's look at the classification of political space. Okay, so again, a political set of political systems, you have a state. And by that, I don't mean the state of Georgia or Texas or New York. I mean a political unit, the United States. France is a state. Spain, Russia, Canada, they're all states. It's an independent political unit. It has sovereignty over its territory, what we call a country. Nation, something that is defined. And it's defined by as a community of people with a common culture occupying a specific territory. So there are several examples we'll go over. Native American nations within the United States and Canada, the Kurds in Syria or Iraq. There is no country of Syria, oh, I'm sorry, of Kurdistan, but populations or groups of Kurds live in both these locations. And here is the idea of a nation state. So here's a nation state, which is a state whose boundaries or territory coincides with the occupation by a nation or people that share general sense of cohesion and adherence to a common set of values. So, for example, Slovenia, Poland, Iceland, and to some extent, Japan. If you ever go to Iceland, for example, a Nordic country in the North Atlantic, everybody there is pretty much the same. The idea of diversity as we think of it in the United States is something that is a bit foreign. And that's just a function of the fact that the majority of the people who live in Iceland are of Icelandic background. That's very different than the United States. That's different than Canada. I mean, I don't think that's a very difficult concept to get. But if you go to a place like Iceland, if you visit there in summer or winter to look at the northern lights, you will easily realize that you're in a place where the majority of people sort of look the same. They have sort of the same background. Okay. The final one here, let's look at Japan. So Japan is a set of islands. It's an archipelago. And as a result of that, they've been sort of isolated by geography. And that geography has basically engendered a sense of cohesion, cultural cohesion, whether you are in the northern island of Hokkaido or whether you are in the main island of Honshu or way, way, way south in Okinawa. some of these islands. It's still Japan. It's Japanese, and they tend to adhere to similar cultural norms. Okay. Now, a stateless nation. Okay. Remember, we talked about nation state. So this would be the opposite of that. It's people without a state. So the Kurds in the Middle East, the Basques or the Catalonians in what we call present day Spain, and the Palestinians who occupy territory within what is presently called Israel. Okay. So these are people, there is no state of Palestine. There is no state of Catalonia. There is a province within Spain called Catalonia, but that's not an independent sovereign location. It belongs to Spain. The same with the Basque region. And here's an example of a stateless nation. So everything in the orange or that yellowish color is where you find people that identify as Kurdish, even though they occupy parts of Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria. Now, Native Americans and Alaska natives. So, as you can see here, everything in the blue or green is what we considered a Native American reservation, with Oklahoma having the largest percentage of Native American blood in the United States. And remember back in lesson two or three, I forget exactly which one, there was a significant bunch of people that were of Seminole, Choctaw, and other tribes that basically, Chickasaw, for example, that were forced to migrate into what we now call Oklahoma in the infamous Trail of Tears. Okay, here's an example. Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Seminole. Think about it. Florida State Seminoles. You've heard of that. And here they are occupying significant part of Oklahoma. You have several others that occupy that location as well. Challenges to the state. So these are challenges to sovereign places. So globalization, this played a big role during COVID. To some extent, that continues. The proliferation of international institution, non-governmental organizations like Doctors Without Borders, for example. Migration flows, this is playing, as I speak, a role in the United States, both legal and illegal migration. The same thing can be said for European nations. This is also a big political hot potato there as well. These are migrants that are coming from Africa and from the Middle East, in their case. The increase of nationalist separatist movements. And are any of these a threat in the United States? And I would say a big resounding yes. Okay. So let's look at the territorial, the morphology of territory, meaning the shape. So you have physical size, obviously. You know, physical size has an advantage. Russia, for example, is the biggest country in the world with spanning 11 time zones. In the US, we span three, actually four. In the lower 48, Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. Russia spans 11. So there are advantages and disadvantages to both being large in terms of physical size as a country and small. So let's look at shape, location, and the idea of cores and capitals. So now, here's some examples. Norway, elongated, thin, but thin east-west, but very, very long north-south. You have places that are considered compact, prorupt, which means it has like a big old panhandle that sort of sticks out, fragmented, bunch of islands, and perforated with another country inside of it. In this case, it happens to be the country of Lesotho inside of present-day South Africa. Okay, so shape. And then you have boundaries, boundary types, geometric, natural, like a river. Uh, and then we'll go over these as well. So let's look at compact. Poland is one such example. It is pretty round. It has a capital near the middle. It's relatively easy to administer if you happen to be the government of that particular state. Um, when you have a pro-rupt state like Haiti, um, then you have this sort of peninsula that kind of sticks out. So if you're here, it's hard to get here because you have to sort of go through the entirety of the country unless you're doing it by boat. So in this case, it presents a geographical problem. Elongated, Cuba, or Chile, which is a very, very, very long north-south country, but a very, very narrow east-west country. Of course, fragmented, many islands. Indonesia. Indonesia is enormous in terms of what it covers in terms of size, yet it is fragmented into thousands of small islands. And of course, perforated, the country of Lesotho, which is entirely surrounded by South Africa. So imagine if the state of Kansas in the United States was its own country. It's sort of a similar setup. Okay, so that is one way to look at the geomorphology or shape of a country. You have an enclave. So in the case of Lesotho, if you go back to this, right, here's South Africa. South Africa is perforated. Lesotho is an enclave, which is a state or part of a state completely within another. Okay. And then you have exclaves, in which a piece of your own country lies outside of your territory. So in the case of Azerbaijan, you have chunks of it, a segment that basically is outside of the main territory. And that presents issues because you, as a administration of the main country, you have to deal with the other country, in this case, Armenia. And I'm sure they have treaties and agreements to make it work, but it's just something else you have to deal with. So an exclave is a territory or state, okay, territory of one state surrounded by that of another. Okay, notice the difference between an exclave and an enclave. Uh, Areas, for example, this happens to be territories that are in dispute between China and Pakistan and India, the famously called Kashmir region that is claimed by both India and Pakistan, which has led to many conflicts between the two. Boundaries, boundaries are complicated. Some of them are easy. So a boundary, if it's a natural one, think of it as a river or a mountain chain. They're relatively easy to sort of manage. Other boundaries are called subsequent, superimposed, and relic. So a subsequent boundary, think about the word itself, subsequent. It is drawn after the development of culture in an area. That's bad. I'm sorry, that's actually the good one. My bad. Superimpose is bad. Drawn, so the culture develops and then the border is sort of arranged around that. Superimposed, on the other hand, is a bad one because it is forced on the existing cultural landscape, meaning it is forced on the people that are already there. And there are many examples of superimposed boundaries, especially in places like the Middle East and Africa. A relic boundary is basically a boundary that really has no meaning anymore. It's an old boundary of an old state that either no longer exists or has been assimilated into a different state. Okay. So let's look at boundaries. Geometric would be the 49th parallel between Canada and the United States. Basically it's a latitude line. So that's why it's called geometric. Now, a natural border would be the Rio Grande between Mexico and the US or Texas. So if you've watched some of the SpaceX launches, if you follow SpaceX and their rockets that they keep testing, they test it literally right there in the extreme southern tip of Texas. Literally, if you're a good golfer, you could hit a golf from SpaceX into Mexico. That's how close it is. The Rio Grande is literally right there. That's a natural boundary. Other natural physical boundaries, for example, would be the Zagros Mountains that separate Iran from Iraq. Okay. Here's an example of both a geometric and a natural boundary. So you have a longitude line, a little bit of the river, and back to a longitude line. Complicated. You have borders that don't mean much. Like, for example, notice it says here that in the United Arab Emirates, its southern border, see how it's a hash line? Notice how it says de facto boundary between United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. Nobody cares. Literally, no one lives here. There's nothing there of value to anyone. There's no oil, nothing. So basically, the UAE and Saudi Arabia don't frankly worry about it. There are no roads, there are no towns, there's no water. And as a result, it's sort of ignored. Now, if magically some resource was found that is worth a lot of money, you better believe that the UAE and Saudi Arabia would work it out. But as of right now, there really is nothing there. Another interesting one would be Antarctica. No one owns Antarctica. There are people that have claims. So there's a New Zealand claim, an Australian, a French, Norwegian. Oddly enough, the US doesn't have any claims in Antarctica, except we have a base literally at the South Pole, and we have a place called McMurdo Station, which is a research location. There it is, McMurdo, right here. And that's it. That's the only US presence in Antarctica. It's basically research. The majority of the people here are conducting scientific research, either climate change research or research on material that comes in from space and lands in Antarctica. So, an interesting, almost administrative way of looking at that region. Again, more on boundaries. So subsequent boundaries, you have two others. You have consequent and superimpose, which we talked about already. Again, a consequent boundary, a boundary that coincides with the breaks in the human landscape, such as language, religion, ethnicity. These are more stable boundaries. Superimposed implies a boundary that was in place over or one that ignores the existing cultural landscape. So a consequent boundary would be the separation between Northern Ireland, which is one of the four components of the United Kingdom, along with Wales, Scotland, and England, and mainland Ireland. Here's the idea of superimposed boundaries. Africa is filled with them. So in the solid line here, you see the actual modern day boundaries of Libya, Egypt, Chad, Niger, Mali, Algeria, and so on. But in the lighter color, you actually see the tribal boundaries. And these tribal boundaries have more cultural meaning and ethnic meaning to the people who live here. But as a function of colonialism, these boundaries remain, and they're not really likely to change anytime soon. Okay. Boundary disputes. So they can be positional. territorial, resource, or functional? So let's look at all four of them. Irredentism. It is the desire of a state to gain or regain territory inhabited by people who are culturally and historically linked to them. We'll get into that coming up here. So the idea of Germany, much of what they did during World War II was irredentist in nature. They felt that people in um, Austria and Switzerland and parts of France and the Netherlands and Poland were sort of Germanic, and they would want to be part of Germany. That's an irredentist feeling. Again, the desire of a state, in this case, Germany, to gain or regain territory inhabited by people who are like them. Okay? And this is a failed and very brief commercial or ad by Absolute Vodka, in which they basically use irredentism. In an absolute world, everything you see in the green would be Mexico. That didn't go over well. Because remember, all of it used to be Mexico a long time ago. But before that, it was Spain. And before that, it was sort of native. So I guess it really depends when you look at it. The Ukraine. I know this has been a hot potato and a big mess since 2021, 22, whenever that started. But if you have to remember that the Ukraine was a member of the Soviet Union or a territory within the at-large Soviet Union before it broke up in 1991. So the Ukraine was very Russified, meaning there were lots and lots of Russians in there already. And as a result, that lingers to this day. So the eastern provinces of the Ukraine are largely Russian as their native language and their heritage, their background. So while this continues to be a hot potato between Russia and Ukraine, and by proxy, the United States, NATO, Europe, many of the people who live here have no issues being part of Russia. Just you don't hear that in the news a lot, but a lot of them don't care. They would frankly rather be part of Russia. But you have the western portion of the Ukraine that's a lot less Russian. And so that in and of itself creates conflict. So this is ongoing. With the new Trump administration, this is likely to change from the Biden administration. So stay tuned. Again, positional, the border. Where is your border? Dispute from a resource point of view. Remember we talked about that border between UAE and Saudi Arabia? No one cares. If there's a resource that suddenly is found, you better believe, like if they suddenly find lithium, which is what all the car batteries and phone batteries and tablets and laptops are made from, you better believe that will become a really, really big deal. You have territorial dispute. Again, irredentism, talked about that one already. And the big one, the wall, the border between the US and Mexico in our case. And this was a big deal, became less of a big deal during the Biden administration. Uh, this is in large part a reason why the 2024 election went the way it did. Some people don't like to hear that, but that's just fact. As a result, prior to the current administration, so prior to the Biden administration of 2020, the US had lots of migration into the US, except that migration was managed. It wasn't as managed in 2021 through 2024. It's just that it's been unchecked. And people have issues with that. Again, whether you're pro-migration or anti-migration, that's really irrelevant. The problem is, as a country who has sovereign control over that location, people want to know that there is some kind of control. And so what's happened? Many of these migrants have gone to places like New York and Chicago and Los Angeles and San Francisco and places like that. And now those places who were miles and miles away from the border are having border issues come to them. And suddenly, oh, it's more problematic than they would have thought. So this is going to remain a big deal. How this is going to change with the new Trump administration starting in 2025, stay tuned. But you better believe there is change coming to this. What that change, what form it takes, I have no idea, but we'll see. Centripetal forces. These are forces that promote cohesion, unifying institutions, organization, good administration, okay? Transportation and communication, and nationalism. Rah, 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 USA, USA, or whatever, wherever you happen to be, Spain, Italy, Canada. Okay. So patriotism, it's kind of a joke here, obviously, but it does have a unifying component to it. Sometimes it can go a little bit too far. Okay. And that becomes problematic. Now, these are the ones where you have centrifugal forces, meaning challenges to the state. So these promote cohesion, but these on the other hand rather promote the state sort of breaking up. Sometimes organized religion can do this. Not always. Nationalism. Notice how nationalism was here in cohesion, but it can also promote breakup. So it's a form of regionalism or separatism. A dissent minority who sees only partial or total separation as its only goal. Um, People who feel that their side is not being represented. And that is more problematic when you have a state that is frankly more diverse, because more diversity implies more problems. And I'm not saying that as a bad thing. There's just more challenges to deal with. When your population is very homogeneous, places like Iceland, Japan, Poland, it's a little easier to sort of come to some kind of consensus. I always think of the United States as a very, very, very kludged together place. It's like imagine you had yellow, red, blue, green, purple, white clay, and you sort of lumped it all together. You would still be able to see the different colors unless you mixed it really well. To me, that's what the US is. And you would never confuse New England or the North with the South or Texas. You would never confuse Texas with California, and they'll be the first to tell you. And you would never confuse the Northwest with, say, the Midwest. We're a very unique country in that sense. We're made up of very, very, very different places. And if you've traveled throughout the United States, and I always recommend travel the US first, there's a lot of really cool stuff to see in this country. You will see that the country is made up of really different kinds of places, just different. I'm not saying that's bad or good. It's just a different, that's why we're so interesting to so many people around the world because we're so different depending on where you go. This is where there are state challenges to cohesion. Scotland, there's been tension between Scotland and the rest of Great Britain. The Basque region in Spain, Catalonia or Catalunya, depending on how you want to call it. So that has been problematic. No, they're still part of Spain. They're still part of the UK. But from time to time, many of the things that are happening in the United States as a function of illegal migration, they're happening in Great Britain. Uh, so Great Britain is sort of going through some of the same similar things we just went through. And now the election of Donald Trump here kind of gives them a little bit of hope if you happen to be of that mindset that they can do something. And by the way, Canada too, because while some people love their current prime minister, Justin Trudeau, a lot of people don't. So it's problematic. The idea of what's going on right now in geopolitics is, well, interesting. Uh, Supranationalism, the United Nations and its agencies, regional and economic alliances. So here are some of the examples. NATO, you've heard of them, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the United Nations, and this one, you may not be familiar with this, BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, BRICS. It's a relatively new economic alliance which is intended to function as a counter to the United States-led G7. So that would be the United States, Canada, France, Germany, the UK, and Japan. Oh, I know I'm getting one wrong, but that's a big deal. Right now, every single financial transaction that happens across the world goes through what's called a SWIFT system, which means everything is managed in US dollars. Even if that transaction is happening between, say, Cambodia and Kenya, it happens in US dollars. It is frankly one of the reasons the US is such a powerful country. Well, these folks, BRICS, would like to change that, and they would like to make their own system that is based on something other than the US dollar. So you better believe the US has a problem with that. So where that's going to go, I don't know. But stay tuned and more to come on BRICS. The United Nations and its agencies, the idea of political, boundaries that extend out into the ocean. So the idea of territorial sea, contiguous zone, exclusive economic zone, and how far they extend out. Again, regional alliances. I didn't put BRICS in here, but it needs to be added. Again, the military alliance happens to be NATO. So NATO, it is a military alliance, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Russia is leery of NATO. Pure and simple. Enter Ukraine. Because the Ukraine is in between Russia and Europe. So they're kind of in a weird spot. And then we'll talk about the idea of political power and electoral geography. So this is important to now. Let's get to this map. So this map right here is the electoral votes for each state. In the blue, states that gained power after the 2020 census. In the red or pink, states that lost power. Texas is becoming the most powerful state in the United States, period. California keeps losing power. Tesla, X, SpaceX, and a whole bunch of other companies have all moved to Austin, Texas. Many people from the north have moved to Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. So there's a shift going on. Now, as a result of this map, the difference in between the 2020 map and the 2024 map as far as electoral votes means Donald Trump received between, I believe it was 7 total more electoral votes as a function of this new map compared to what he would have gotten had the same map been, before in 2020 or 2016 or 2012, okay, when those elections took place. So this is a big deal. This happens every 10 years, and the next time this becomes an issue will be in 2032 because we will be past the 2030 census. Okay. Gerrymandering. So this is the idea of drawing boundaries, especially for the House. And it really creates these really ugly boundaries that you see here, these different House districts that you hear about, like New York 10, Texas 20, blah, blah, blah. And as a result, when you have really populated areas like Chicago, you tend to have lots of smaller districts. Whereas if you live in less populated area, you have bigger, less populated districts. Okay. So it may advantage a particular class of candidates in a way. Um, Sometimes they have the most bizarre borders. Like, for example, this district here, 20, New York 20, extends all the way from Dutchess, clear up to Lake Placid, and west into Delaware County. It's kind of odd. Now, some of them are a little bit less confusing. Like this one, well, this one's actually as confusing. Part to Orange, Ulster, Sullivan, it goes through Binghamton, and then all the way up to Ithaca. So they're very, very sort of kludged together. Confusing, quite frankly. But that's the state of politics as of today. So, in any event, this is the lesson. It's a bit of an update. I hope you find this information interesting because it kind of is. I mean, it really drives many of the political processes that happen in this country on a daily basis. Um, I will be making available, there will be available in the class page some information on elections and maps that you can look at on your own. And in any event, I hope you find this interesting and I hope you have a great rest of your week. Otherwise, we will talk to you soon. Bye.